Hello everybody and welcome back. As always, I am Mateo311 and this is your channel for everything VR related. Today, we're talking about why casual VR games are quote-unquote better. Now, I'll explain exactly what that means in this context, as evaluating games can be extremely subjective, and I'll also go over why we're not getting any higher-end blockbuster-style VR games. As much as people want to blame lazy developers and the Quest 2 for ruining VR, this topic goes a lot deeper. Now, if you are holding out for AAA VR games, there's plenty of hope for the near future, but before I explain, this video is sponsored by Kiwi Design, one of my favorite sites for VR accessories. They recently released some new Quest 2 headphones that promise to pack some extra bass and increase your audio experience. They currently have my favorite Quest 2 Elite strap with battery pack, and there's plenty of other accessories like enhanced controller grips, replacement facial covers, link cables, and much more. There's a link down in the description, and don't forget to use discount code Mateo311 for 5% off and to help support this channel. Okay, so let's start off with the topic of how are casual games better, but before we do that, we need to define what a casual game is. These are titles that are made to appeal to the largest audience possible. They generally lack items like mature themes, storylines, excessive complexity, higher-end graphics, and they usually have a smaller budget. Now, going back to the whole better aspect, I'm not going to be evaluating the game content itself, but rather just the title's profitability and player base. Now, for many, myself included, this type of evaluation is sacrilege. Sadly, though, these are two of the biggest issues that VR developers face, and we do need a way to objectively compare these games. But at the same time, if we use the same criteria in other industries, the quote-unquote better movies would be the cheap B- horror flicks, and the better mobile games would be the super addictive and player-exploiting ones like Diablo Immortal and Raid Shadow Legends. All of these either produce the biggest bang for the buck or boast insane player counts, but it usually comes at the consumer's expense, as these titles could tap into addictive gambling tendencies or just produce subjectively inferior products. When the focus is purely on profits, the product ultimately suffers. So in just about any industry, this is hardly what should be categorized as better, but VR is an extremely unique platform, and while profit remains a major aspect of VR development, it's a necessity rather than just pure greed. After nearly 7 years, VR game development is still a serious gamble, but let's go into further detail on why we aren't getting AAA style VR games. One of the biggest reasons is, in general, higher-end VR titles have failed. During the early days of PCVR, games were even more casual than they are now. Every other title was a wave shooter, the industry was still afraid to use artificial locomotion, and most games were under 60 minutes long. But everyone loved the technology and assumed if we got higher-end titles, it would blow up and go mainstream. Enter both Valve, releasing the absolutely amazing Half-Life Alyx, and Meta funding major studios to produce VR games. Unfortunately, though, this wasn't enough to move the needle for the VR industry. The burden of entry and complexity still remained a bit too high, and while Half-Life Alyx was considered a major success, nearly doubling the PCVR player base overnight, 2 million players, just isn't enough to fund AAA titles. Valve has never released any official numbers. It's assumed that they did eventually make some profit on this game, but they're a company with a deeper stake in VR, and unlike many other studios, they could afford to take this gamble, and they already had a lot of VR development experience. Now, Meta, and more importantly, other development studios, quickly learned that being able to develop high-quality flat screen games doesn't necessarily translate into high quality VR games. There's a very specific learning curve to VR development that took many studios years to master. Initial attempts from Bethesda, Insomniac Games, and Respawn range from bad to excessively mediocre, and in most cases were rarely or minimally profitable. Now, when you start evaluating the successful VR titles that are already out there, complexity kills, the stats just don't lie. More complex titles such as Onward end up collecting a strong yet smaller following of dedicated gamers. This sometimes creates an environment which discourages new players from joining, as the majority of players are overly experienced and excessively competitive. Limited growth will be the death of any game. Another perfect example is Valve VR. Their ambitious goals of creating a highly competitive, graphically intense shooter is alienating the mainstream or casual players. For starters, the majority of VR gamers can't run this title as it's PCVR only, and the current daily player count is peaking at around 80. And this is almost entirely made up of hardcore members of the game's community who beta tested the title and have never stopped playing. A newbie or casual can be easily frustrated going up against such experienced players. So in its current stage, VR is still being pushed more towards casual titles. Larger studios that dipped their toes into VR early on quickly realized they weren't going to make much profit, which is why games like Doom VFR, Batman VR, and Wolfenstein Cyberpilot were either half-assed or just extremely short. Now, Meta addressed the situation by making VR much more affordable with the Quest 2. While it did put VR into the hands of millions of new gamers, it also had some additional consequences. It basically reset the whole VR gaming industry, and this time with hardware that was much more limited. Developers are now forced to do more with less, spending a lot of additional time on optimization. VR game development was almost starting from square one all over again, but at least this time they had the player base to make games more profitable. But a newer reason why we don't have these blockbuster style games that everyone seems to forget is that they take years to develop. Higher end PCVR games started popping up roughly 3+ years after VR's commercial release, which is a pretty standard development time for a larger game. Even something like the Resident Evil 4 Quest 2 port was years in development, and they started with an already fully developed game. So the VR industry recently hit reset, and they've been developing on that new hardware for less than 3 years. But we will be entering into that time frame next year, and I already know some bigger unannounced titles that we should see. I've spoken to multiple individuals who have confirmed an Asgard's Wrath 2 coming to the Quest 2, and Assassin's Creed Nexus is supposedly looking much better than the leaks we got roughly a year ago. So even with all these new hurdles, these games are coming, it just takes some time. But there's another issue that prevents us from getting blockbuster style games like God of War. VR is just a very different beast. Just like development, storytelling has to be handled differently. VR doesn't lend itself well to traditional cutscenes. Standing around listening to people talk in VR feels like a chore. This is yet another learning curve for VR developers. How can they implement a deep narrative without boring a VR gamer who wants to constantly keep moving around? It's easy to sit back on your couch, enjoy some beautiful eye candy, and over-the-top action. Unfortunately, when it comes to VR, the player's gaze isn't fixed, cutscene windows are immersion breaking, and eye candy is in short supply on the Quest 2. So even after all of this time, VR is still figuring itself out, and traditional storytelling needs to be replaced by a new VR-specific, environmental-based method of storytelling. This is quite nuanced and less straightforward, so many developers just focus on the mechanics. And in truth, this is where VR games tend to truly shine. VR is a whole new platform, so it only makes sense it should be utilized differently. Developers have found a lot of success here, and games like Beat Saber or other workout titles like Supernatural are prime examples. These games just would not work on flat screen, and both the VR aspect and motion controls are part of the magic. The majority of the time, the most successful VR games are the ones with high replayability and fun mechanics. Successful big budget VR games do exist, but they are outliers, and smaller, more casual titles are the much safer bet. You can clearly see this with some of the more prominent VR studios like Resolution Games, as they continue to pump out hit after hit, and they basically have a fun game for any type of gamer out there. Even Big Box, the developers of one of VR's most popular shooters, Population 1, has realized this trend and shifted more into casual gameplay with their new world-building sandbox mode. But if you desperately want AAA style VR games, all hope is not lost. That 3-year development window is coming to an end, so we'll soon see those larger titles that have been in development for quite some time. Much more powerful hardware is right around the corner with PlayStation VR 2 coming in February, and the Quest 3 supposedly releasing in mid-2023. Plus, Sony has already stated that they want to bring the quality of VR games much closer in line with flat screen games, and they're using 2 of their major IPs to do it, including Resident Evil and Horizon. Valve could also be entering the mix soon, because they have a game titled Neon Prime in the works, which was previously codenamed Citadel. I'm expecting to get a lot more information on that game in 2023, and who knows, we might even get the Valve Deckard. So right there, guys, that's the main reason why VR games have been so casual, what's taking AAA titles so long, and what we should expect moving into 2023. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments, I'd love to hear them. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, and as always, I'll see you guys on next time.